Good afternoon, learners. Welcome to NIOS. And today we will be covering chapter 18 in your syllabus, that is Night of the Scorpion. So this poem was written by Nissim Ezekiel, a pioneering Indian English poet who in his poems included both romantic and modern elements. He resolved to design his poetic world with the images of urbanity and contemporary India, which takes a leading space in his poetry. He is also known as the father of modern English poetry. Nissim Ezekiel is the master of many art forms. He is a prolific dramatist, critic, broadcaster and social commentator. Ezekiel also taught at different universities in India. He has been a professor in UK and USA. Okay, so he was a professor of literature. Ezekiel tries to focus on Indian values and ideals, and he is intentionally and painfully conscious of the defects of modern Indian people. He has honestly portrayed the picture of India with its culture, people, social norms, belief, religion, myth, and so forth. He has no intentions to glorify India with false images. So learners, what did you learn? Yes, that Nissim Ezekiel always portrayed the reality he always portrayed the reality in his poems, in his works. He did not hide anything. He did not show any false impressions. Okay, he portrayed the picture of true India in his works. So learners, this is a picture of Nissim Ezekiel. Please look at the picture. Like eminent writers of the world, Ezekiel moves beyond all borders, and a modern poet in him seeks a reformation through Indian values, peace and non-violence. So Nissim Ezekiel, learners, like you know, he was a very prolific and a very famous poet. He is also known as the father of modern English poetry. Now learners, let's go through the poem together. Let's read the poem together, learners. I remember the night my mother was stung by a scorpion. 10 hours of steady rain had driven him to crawl beneath a sack of rice. Parting with his poison, flash of diabolic tail in the dark room. He risked the rain again. The peasants came like swarms of flies and buzzed the name of God 100 times to paralyze the evil one. With candles and with lanterns, throwing giant scorpion shadows, on the mud-baked walls they searched for him. He was not found. They clicked their tongues. With every movement that the scorpion made, his poison moved in mother's blood, they said. May your suffering decrease the misfortunes of your next birth, they said. May the sum of evil balanced in this unreal world against the sum of good become diminished by your pain. May the poison purify your flesh of desire and your spirit of ambition, they said. And they sat around on the floor with my mother in the center. The peace of understanding on each face, more candles, more lanterns, more neighbors, more insects, and the endless rain. My mother twisted through and through, groaning on a mat. My father, skeptic, rationalist, trying every curse and blessing, powder, mixture, herb and hybrid. He even poured a little paraffin upon the bitten toe and put a match to it. I watched the flame feeding on my mother. I watched the holy man perform his rites to tame the poison with incantation. After 20 hours, it lost its tongue. My mother only said, "Thank God, the scorpion picked on me and spared my children." So learners, isn't this poem beautiful? So let me show you this diagram, learners. So this basically shows the major themes covered in the poem. So if you look at the diagram, so basically in the center, the name of the poem, and it shows how the scorpions attack. Second theme, it shows the role of villagers. Then the role of the skeptic and the rationalist father. And finally, this poem shows mother and her agony, her pain. Okay, so these are basically the 4 major themes that have been covered in the poem. The Night of the Scorpion, learners, can be interpreted into 2 different ways. First, the poet describes how on a rainy day the narrator's mother is bitten by a scorpion and what are the chain reactions to it. Second, the poem depicts the Indian ethos. Ethos means, learners, culture. Okay, the poem depicts the Indian culture, superstitions and cultural richness through a simple incident symbolizing the typical motherhood which is depicted for her sacrifice and affection for her children. So this poem can be considered very typical, okay, and it is very culturally oriented. Indian mothers are known for their sacrificial attitude, okay, and in this poem it is depicted beautifully. The poet narrates the poem by remembering his childhood when his mother was bitten by a scorpion. He says that the continuous rainfall for 10 hours had driven the scorpion into the house, where it crawled beneath a sack of rice. When his mother entered the dark room, the scorpion parted the poison into her toe and disappeared. After stinging the poet's toe with his deadly tail, the scorpion immediately left the area and headed to the pouring rain. This is what a scorpion looks like, learners. It's very poisonous in nature. Okay, if you ever get bit by a scorpion, it's very difficult to recover because the scorpion is full of poison. The news spread, the biting, when the scorpion bit the mother. The news spread throughout the village and the peasants gathered in the poet's house in large numbers like swarms of flies and buzzed God's name about 100 times, praying to God to stop the movements of the scorpion. They believed that the scorpion, like with every move of the scorpion, the pain would aggravate in the mother and the poison would spread throughout her blood. So the villagers came to the poet's house. They wanted to kill the scorpion because they believed that with every movement, with every move of the scorpion, the poison would increase in the mother's blood. So the villagers searched the poet's house with candles and lanterns to paralyze the evil scorpion. But the scorpion was very clever. He disappeared in the dark. As a number of villagers gathered in the house, the shadows they formed on the walls too appeared as a scorpion to the poet. So this is an example of imagery, learners. Okay? The villagers clicked their tongues and prayed to God to immobilize the scorpion. It was believed that every movement made by the scorpion would increase the spread of the poison in the mother's body, thus making the pain more severe. The villagers prayed that the scorpion stops and the sins of mother's previous birth gets washed away that night, or her sufferings might decrease the misfortunes of her next birth. Learners, villagers had this another superstition also. They believed that mother's pain, would wash away the sins of a previous birth and would decrease the misfortunes of her next birth. Okay, so this is what they believed in. They said this way the sums of evil might get balanced in this unreal world. They called the world unreal as everything in this world is temporary and birth and deaths keep occurring in cycle. The superstitious parents believed that the current suffering would burn away earlier evil actions, or that the current suffering learners would free one to endure no suffering in the next birth. In the poem Learners, the pain is the equalizer of hope, okay, in the temporal world. So the ignorant parents wished that the poison must purify the poet's mother's body and soul. The ignorant, the superstitious peasants, learners, they are praying that the scorpion should be killed. They are empathizing with the mother. They are watching her groan and moan in pain. Okay, and with the pain, they are talking among themselves that, if the pain prolongs, then this would actually would wash away the sins of a previous birth and decrease the sorrows and the misfortunes of the next birth. They are hopeful that the pain would do that. The main idea of Night of the Scorpion is that it is a representation of rural Indian ethos, learners. Like I have said before, ethos means culture. It believes on evil, suffering and its people. The villagers even prayed to God that the poison will purify her flesh. They sat around the mother who was groaning in pain. There was calmness as they thought that she had approached her end. The condition was becoming very critical, learners, as many neighbors were entering the house with more candles and lanterns. The insects were also increasing and the rain also continued. With the mother, learners, even the villagers, they were helpless. They were trying to find the scorpion, but they were helpless. Their efforts went in vain. All they could do was just to pray to God to lessen the mother's suffering. Whereas on the other hand, learners, the poet's father was a skeptic. Skeptic means a person who doubts everything. He was a skeptic and a rationalist who experimented with powders, combinations, and plants to treat his mother. However, because it was a difficult circumstance, he also attempted prayers and blessings. He burned the bitten toe by pouring paraffin on it. There was a priest also in the house, learners. The priest, who had also arrived at the location, was performing holy ceremonies to tame the poison, learners. Tame means to reduce the poison. So after the father's efforts and even the priest's efforts, after 20 hours, after 20 long hours, the sting was gone. After being cured, the mother praised God for choosing her and sparing her children. So learners, isn't it beautiful? This shows the sacrificial love, the unending love of a mother towards her children. Night of the Scorpion is a poem. Like I have said before, learners, it is a poem based on Indian scenario of superstitions and traditions and poet's Indian feelings. It represents an incident in the past when the poet's mother was stung by a scorpion. It was a rainy night. The continuous 10-hour rains have driven the scorpion to crawl beneath a sack of rice to keep itself dry. The poet's father believed in reason and logic. He applied his common sense to relieve his wife's pain. He poured some paraffin upon the bitten toe and put a flash of matchstick to it. So basically he lit the paraffin which he attached to the mother's toe. Even a holy man was called to chant mantras, but everything went in vain. Nothing happened, or the poet doesn't believe that if these mantras helped. But after long 20 hours, the old lady, the mother, got relief from the pain and she thanked God. She was so thankful and grateful to God that the scorpion did not sting his children. Beautiful. Now learners, let's go through some themes in the poem. So basically, the first theme that has been covered in the poem is the theme of a rainy day. Well, in the first stanza, you will know that it describes an occurrence that occurred on a rainy night. The poet recalls that it had been raining heavily for 10 hours, and that a scorpion had crawled beneath a bag of rice in the poet's home to avoid getting wet. Then, unfortunately, the scorpion stung the poet's mother. And after biting his mother, the scorpion with his diabolic tail. Diabolic, learners, means evil, something which has poison. Okay, so after biting the mother, the scorpion with its poisonous tail left the house. One thing is certain, the scorpion arrived to defend itself from the continuous rain. And it may have bitten just to protect itself. Animals do that, insects do that. They attack, they bite to protect themselves. The poet's description of the scorpion as diabolic shows the poet's rage towards it, which is understandable from the perspective of a son. So, if you look at the poem, the poet calls the scorpion diabolic. Diabolic, which I told you, means something evilish. It means something poisonous. So why is the scorpion referring to why is the poet referring the scorpion as diabolic? Because he has deep grudges against him. He is angry towards him. Why did the scorpion bite the mother? Why did the scorpion bite his mother? He is very angry. That is why he is choosing such negative terms for the scorpion. The next theme is the concern of the neighboring peasants. Okay, learners, this is the next theme of the poem. Upon knowing the poet's mother was stung by a scorpion, the neighboring peasants quickly came to the poet's house like swarms of flies. They took God's name 100 times in order to paralyze the evil. And who is this evil? Yes, scorpion. They started to find out the scorpion, but their search went in vain. The peasants clicked their tongues. The link between individual families and neighboring peasants is prominent here. In contrast to city settings, people in rural areas live in peace and harmony. They help each other. In Delhi or in urban areas, do neighbors help you? No, they don't even care who you are. But yes, if you go to small towns, if you go to villages, if something happens in one house, all the community, they come together to help that family. The poet's family has a close contact with the nearby peasants. Those who stepped up to rescue were quite helpful. Here the poet uses the simile like swarms of flies. Okay, so he, like swarms of flies, he's using it to compare the movement of flies and the people to the poet's house. The people in general are conventional. Okay, they are conventional. Conventional means they have old thinking. Okay, they believe in old traditions. So, in the poem, the villagers are conventional and they follow their customs, and this is reflected in the poem. When the poet's mother was stung by a scorpion, they began chanting, they began clicking their tongues. Learners, what do you mean by clicking their tongues? They started chanting. The moment they came to the poet's house and the moment they got to know about the severity of the incident, they started chanting. The third theme is views on the victim. The villagers said that with every movement made by the scorpion would accelerate the spread of the poison in the victim's body, making the suffering more severe. They wanted the scorpion would remain motionless so that the agony would be less terrible. They also said that the pain would cleanse her of the sins of a previous birth. Moreover, learners, they said that the suffering will decrease the misfortunes of a next birth. They thought that the sum of all evil and good might be balanced by the pain suffered by the mother. Furthermore, they thought that the poison might purify the flesh of her desire and ambition. The villagers sat around the mother on the floor and they looked content, for they thought they grasped the situation. It is ironic that they thought they had understood her pain, whereas they could not understand the groaning of the poet's mother. They thought that by their old traditions, by old superstitions, if they followed that, the pain would reduce. They thought that they understood the mother's pain, but they failed to do that. More neighbors visited the house with candles and lanterns, and the rain kept showering. Poet's mother, on the other hand, was just rolling on the mat, and her pain was getting intense. The neighbors wanted to kill the scorpion to stop the pain of the mother, but at the same time they believed that the pain is the outcome of the past evil, or the pain is the way to lessen the misfortunes in the next birth. Isn't it a contradictory belief, learners? Where the pain is the symbol of sins, it is also the symbol of cleansing at the same time. Okay, so it seems like a very contradictory statement. The villagers may be superstitious, but their concern for the poet's mother who was suffering is really appreciable. Okay, so their chants, their unity in the poem, it's quite appreciative. The mother on the one hand is groaning in pain, at least they're sympathizing, they're empathizing with the mother. This thought is very appreciable on the villagers' part. Now the fourth theme is the reaction of the poet's father. Like we have discussed before, the poet's father, he was a skeptic and a rationalist. He implemented his knowledge of science in that incident. He tried to relieve his wife's pain through his knowledge of science. He tried every blessing, power, mixture, herbs, hybrid, medicines. He tried everything to relieve his wife of the pain. At last, he was helpless. He poured a little paraffin upon the bitten toe and put a flash of matchstick to it. The flame feeding on my mother means that the flame is eating up his mother's toe. So the poet's father was helpless. He had no knowledge. Being a skeptic, he did not believe in the old traditions, the intensity of old traditions. So he poured a little paraffin and he lit it. Okay, so he was helpless. The poet dramatizes a contrast between the worlds of irrationality and logic, as represented by the villagers and the father. Though the father was a rational person, his decision to apply paraffin on the mother's toe was not. We can't, however, learners, ignore his motivation in attempting to save his wife from suffering in that terrible position. Thank you, learners, for joining. We'll meet next time.